This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a veteran journalist, formerly with the New York Times. He is the author of several books. Most recently is a biography called Elie Wiesel, Confronting the Silence. It has just been published by Yale University Press as part of their Jewish Lives series. Joseph Berger, hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Well, thank you for having me.
So Elie Wiesel has become one of the most iconic Jewish intellectuals of the second half of the 20th century, primarily thanks to his Holocaust literature and his seminal book, Night. Now, if you had to put your finger on one or two features of his greatness, what do you think that would be?
Elie Wiesel, more than any other person, seared the Holocaust into the consciousness of the world. You have to understand that in the years after World War II, there was actually very little written or spoken about the Holocaust. The reason was that the survivors were often too traumatized, didn't feel that people would understand. And in America, for example, many Americans were ashamed that they hadn't done more to save the refugees, save the Jews of Europe, a third of whom were killed. So because of that, Wiesel, first through Night, but eventually through his speeches and his books and his essays, exhumed the Holocaust from the burial grounds of history. And when people were ready to talk about it, which took place after the 1967 war, when there was this explosion of Jewish pride, and people wanted to know more about what happened during the war, Wiesel was the person who was able to do that.
So was it his courage and his willingness to talk about it? Or
his courage, his willingness.
As also a writer, what was it really about his literary knack?
He was eloquent. Though he came out of a Hasidic background, because of the war, he ended up in an orphanage outside of Paris and went to the Sorbonne, where he studied philosophy and literature. That not too many survivors could have that kind of background. So he was, as I said, very eloquent, erudite. He had a handsome face. He had the look of a person who'd suffered greatly, and I think all of that enhanced his ability to transmit his message. And he understood that the survivors needed someone to speak for them, and that he more than anyone else could do that for them.
Yeah. So, of course, he was a survivor originally from Romania, Hungary, that area. Then, after the war, ended up in France, and then came to the United States.
Right. As a journalist, by the way, very few people knew that about Wiesel.
For an Israeli newspaper, right?
For Yediot Ahronot, yes.
Yeah. So it is an interesting journey for someone like him. First of all, why did he choose America? And why did he not stay in France, where, as you said, he went to the Sorbonne, he became immersed in the French culture. He was friendly with great intellectuals of the time, Jean-Paul Sartre, and his patron was Francois Mauriac, the Nobel Prize winner. And also, one thing that I also learned from your book is that he continued to write in French until throughout his life.
Yeah,
right?
because that was the language he was most comfortable in, besides Hungarian, which he wasn't going to write internationally about.
So why America?
Basically, he was assigned by Yediot Achronot to become the UN correspondent for Yediot Achronot. And so he was sent to America as a correspondent. And he came here writing stories about Marilyn Monroe and her marriage to Joe DiMaggio, that kind of, he was a regular correspondent. And he got to know Abba Eban, and he got to know Golda Meir because of his work in the UN. And so he began to see a place for himself in New York circles. And I think that made a big difference as well. And when the moment came that that people wanted to find out more about what happened during the war. I mean, don't forget, Eichmann had also just a few years before been tried in Israel. When people look for a speaker to talk about the Holocaust, he was there. And he had written a book, Night, that was beautifully done, and it became a textbook of the Holocaust in a way, more than almost any other book. So all of that kind of stationed him in New York for good.
Mm-hmm. So you never thought about going back to France or even making Aliyah and settling in Israel?
No, and he had. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. I'm sure you'll ask me, but he had very mixed feelings about living in Israel, because he went to Israel very much in great passion as a correspondent for Yediot Achronot when he was in France, and he spent a few months there. And was disappointed because he felt the Israelis, the native Israelis, looked down on the Holocaust survivors because they hadn't fought back. And he felt they didn't understand what it was like in Europe.
That was in the 1950s.
In the early 50s, exactly. Or maybe even the late 40s. He felt that Israelis didn't understand what it was like in Europe. That no one knew that the end point was extermination. They looked back at what had happened during World War I, and the Germans treated the Jews like they treated anybody else. And there was no effort to single them out as victims. But this time, German soldiers would shoot you at a whim. So you without knowing that you were that the alternative was the gas chamber, because they didn't know that yet. They did everything they could to save their lives, so they weren't going to necessarily confront these soldiers who came to their door and wanted to deport them. So he felt Eli felt that the Israelis didn't understand. So he was disappointed on his first trip. Then he came again to Israel, and by this time he was Elie Wiesel. Came again to Israel, and he gave a talk at a meeting of the Jewish Agency, I believe. And in that talk, he asked the Israelis, this is shortly after the 73 war, to be a little more compassionate toward the problems of the Palestinians. And the Israelis press and officials said, in effect, said to him, "Who are you to tell us how to run our country? You're living in the diaspora." So he had this difficult relationship, and he decided he wasn't going to criticize Israel again. He loved Israel. I mean, he loved it. He was so happy that there was this country, because if it had been there during the war, a lot fewer Jews would have been killed.
And after that, there was, towards the end of his life, was criticized for not criticizing Israel enough.
That's right.
So how did that Is it because he was, a once bitten, twice shy sort of reaction?
Right. So, but he later in his life he was criticized by the left in America for being too beholden to the Netanyahu government, and for not, for example, not addressing issues like the Sabra and Shatila, the settlements, the expansion of the settlements, and for advertisements that he ran in the New York Times that attacked the Palestinians in Gaza for their what he called it child sacrifice in a manner of a kind of a medieval or biblical sense, because they put their weapons inside apartment buildings where there were children.
And how did he react to this criticism? I mean, I'm guessing that you're saying that it was...
As I said, he was very strongly devoted to Israel and wasn't going to criticize it. And he did not till the end of his life.
Mm-hmm. There's another thing about Elie Wiesel in Israel, which is, you said earlier that he was Elie Wiesel. In America, it was Elie Wiesel. But in Israel, not so much. I wouldn't say that he was the go-to Holocaust writer, not even the top 5.
Well, don't forget.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Right. Don't forget. In America, the Holocaust survivors, there were about 150,000 of them who came over right after the war. So they were a tiny minority. In Israel, there are probably, a third of the population is either the children of survivors or the grandchildren of survivors or the survivors, the few survivors themselves. So, he didn't stand out much in Israel, but he did stand out in the United States as a leader of this group. In Israel, he had plenty of competition. There were other writers in Hebrew who were as good as he was, and that wasn't true in America. Not among the survivors. I mean, there were many very good Jewish writers, but not among the survivors.
But also, as I said, the community of survivors was fairly small. But was he able to tap into broader circles of American Jews who had been here for generations, and also to a non-Jewish American audience?
Absolutely among the Jews in America? He put the Holocaust on the map. So they were. Night has sold 14 million copies. It is now read in junior high schools and high schools across the country that require Holocaust education. Oprah Winfrey, put him on her show, and as a result, his books, the sale of his book, particularly Night, exploded. So, he is an icon beyond the Jewish world here.
But what you said earlier was that it was also almost a coincidence that it has become that. Also, Night was not written in English. It took some time to be translated and published for an American or an English publisher. And also, the place that he has found for himself here was also somewhat, just came here for work and managed to find his way into literary circles in America. There's still this missing link between that and becoming this great icon that he was.
Well, there were several things happened. Jimmy Carter, because he was worried about the Jewish vote in the 1980 election, decided to create a council to plan a Holocaust memorial of some kind. And he was advised by several people to appoint Elie Wiesel as chairman. So Elie Wiesel now is chairman of the council planning a Holocaust memorial in Washington. So that gave him enormous stature as well. Beyond that, he had, and this is circumstantial, but was fascinating. When Ronald Reagan, and by the way, the museum became one of the most visited sites in Washington.
That's the Holocaust Museum in Washington.
The Holocaust Museum in Washington. And then beyond that, in 1985, I think, 86, President Ronald Reagan decided to make a trip to Germany at the invitation of Helmut Kohl, the chancellor there. And it turned out he was going to visit a military cemetery called Bitburg in the town of Bitburg. And it later was revealed that in that cemetery there were 49 SS men buried. These were the people who murdered and tortured Jews during the war. So the Jewish community was in an uproar, and everybody looked to Elie Wiesel to speak about it. And by circumstance, it turned out that Ronald Reagan, 2 weeks before he was to leave, had to give Elie Wiesel a Congressional Medal of Achievement. And in doing so, he said to Ronald Reagan, "I know you didn't know that there was SS men buried in Bitburg when you were invited, but now everyone knows. And that place, Mr. President, is not your place." That became front page news all over the country.
Yeah, he said it publicly, right? It was
There were TV cameras there, much to the consternation of the White House. And it was no one could remember anyone confronting a president in the White House like that. And that became elevated Wiesel to a certain stature nationwide, not just in the Holocaust community or not just the Jewish community. And a year later, he received the Nobel Prize for peace. So Elie Wiesel became Elie Wiesel.
Yeah. I want to ask you about writing that book. They say often, I can't remember who it was, that the autobiography is the biographer's biggest enemy. When you do your research as a biographer, it's always easiest to go to the autobiography because it's all there, but then again, it's very subjective. Elie Wiesel published a two-part autobiography that was well written and well received, like much of what it did. To what extent did it serve you in your endeavor, and to what extent it hindered it?
Well, because Elie Wiesel had died in 2016, before I even began my research for the book, the memoir was essential because he describes private events. For example, his things no one knew about him. He very candidly talks about his relation with women as a young man, trying to with a strict yeshiva background, trying to figure out how to romance women. And it's very touching, but all that's is in the memoir. There's no other way I was going to find that out. So it was essential. But the memoir also had to be weighed against things that we also knew. I give you a slight example, but it's a funny one. Both he and the Yiddish writer Isaac Bashevis Singer were working on the forwards together. And Singer was the star of the forwards. Wiesel was a freelancer, hadn't made a name for himself yet. Anyway, they became friends right away because they both lived on the Upper West Side. They would take the subway together to the Upper West Side. And then they had a falling out. Wiesel reviewed a book by Singer that Singer felt wasn't generous enough. And Singer reviewed a book by Wiesel that Wiesel felt wasn't generous enough. So they had a falling out. And as he described this relationship in his memoir, he then goes on to say, it was kind of sad at the end that because Singer, after he died, very few people came to his funeral. Well, I covered the funeral for the New York Times, and it was packed. So Wiesel gave a zets. I mean, look, the book is an overwhelming tribute to a great man who, as I said, seared the Holocaust. But he was human, and perhaps his memory was off on that. Maybe he was thinking of some other event. But and actually, I think that's important to say that what I try to do in the book is to humanize him, because he's often seen as a prophetic figure.
Yeah, and also it's interesting because this is the first biography of Wiesel.
That's right.
To be published. Not a single one came out during his life, even after he became Elie Wiesel, this iconic figure. Why do you think that is?
I mean, there was a young adult biography, shorter one, and there was a biography that traced his religious development, but not a classic biography with all the personal information that you'd expect. Well, first of all, because there was a memoir, there may not have been the felt need to do something, and until he died, people don't usually do biographies while a person is alive. It turns out that there are at least 2 documentarians that I know are doing film biographies of Elie Wiesel. So it's developing, and I won't be surprised if someone does a big tome on him as well.
Was he defensive? I mean, you met him several times.
Many times, yes.
And you interviewed him.
He was he gave an endorsement for a memoir I wrote. Mm-hmm. He came to a book party of mine, and I interviewed him when he won the Nobel Prize. And again, he was just wonderfully candid. I asked him, how do you go on believing in a God who allowed 6 million Jews and 1.5 million children to be slaughtered that way? And he says, I argue with him all the time, but because of our arguments, I get closer to him as a result. I mean, it's a wonderful, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but it was just a wonderful way he had of looking at things. So I interviewed him once on the stage of the New York Times auditorium. So we had a lot of interaction.
So he was forthcoming to journalists and interviewers.
Absolutely.
And okay, and it wasn't. So I don't know. To me, it sounds. It is peculiar that not a single biography of this great man was published in his lifetime.
As I said, I think people often wait.
Yeah.
On that.
So I want to go back to what you just said about the question of faith and the great ambivalence that is encapsulated in his relationship to faith, to God. And also, if taking into account what you said about Israel earlier, it seems like this duality or maybe ambivalence is something that is really characteristic of the way he used to look at things.
I don't think ambivalence quite captures it. I think you have to understand, he grew up in a Hasidic village, a heavily Hasidic village, Sighet. And his grandfather was a Sighet Hasid, and so was his mother. And he loved the study of Talmud. He loved the study, began the study of Kabbalah. He loved reading about the Torah, the figures in the Torah. He loved the rituals. He loved the Sabbath. And so he would often say, just because I'm angry at God, why should I take it out on Shabbos? He wasn't going to give that up. And he for almost his entire life, he was observant in that way. He loved to sing Yiddish songs. He loved to sing the melodies of the synagogue, and often melodies that were strange to other Americans, because his melodies were from the Vishnitz Hasidic background.
To what extent do you think that his legacy still lives on among American Jews today? I mean, his life experiences, as a Holocaust survivor, but also all this Yiddishkeit and all this, Jewish culture of old Europe that he lived so passionately.
Well, look, when you walk into the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, there is engraved on the first wall you encounter his wonderful statement about love is not hate, it's indifference. And other statements of Wiesel's. People know of his role in the museum. They know he won a Nobel Prize. Night is still heavily read around the world. So I believe his legacy is going to continue in a very strong way.
But also more broadly, do you think, I mean, it's a problem with the fact that many Holocaust survivors are dying out, and the struggle to keep the memory alive is becoming much more tangible. And, about Wiesel himself, does his great legacy, everything that he left behind, in a way makes up for his physical absence? The fact that he cannot speak himself about his own experiences? Absolutely.
I mean, I think that his books, besides Night, he wrote some wonderful collections of essays. I think those are read. Several of his novels are really first rate. So I think that will remain. But the other thing is, he didn't just confine himself to the Holocaust. He spoke out against genocide everywhere, in Cambodia, in Nicaragua, in Bosnia, and his role in that will certainly resonate through the years. You can't predict what will happen. I mean, Martin Luther King is still on people's minds in a big way, probably as big as it was during his lifetime. I think Wiesel might, you can't, again, who can say what the future is, but I think Elie Wiesel will always be very much associated with the Holocaust and with genocide. In fact, his Nobel Prize was that he was a messenger to mankind. Mm-hmm. And that's how he's going to be remembered.
All right. Joe Berger, a veteran journalist, formerly with the New York Times, and the author of the new biography, Elie Wiesel, Confronting the Silence. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studio. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.